My wife of 45 years had just been lowered into the ground, and my children were already measuring our house for renovations. They inherited her $30 million empire, including the companies, the estates, the luxury apartments, and the cars. I received nothing but a dusty envelope, mocked and humiliated, told to pack my bags, by my own flesh and blood. I opened it alone that night in a cheap motel room. Inside was a single sheet of paper bearing an offshore bank account number and one line written by hand. "This is for the man who always loved me truly." And when I pulled up the balance, I understood in an instant that my children had just made the gravest mistake of their lives. Welcome back to His Hidden Revenge. I'm glad you're here with me today. If these stories of quiet strength and hard truth speak to something in you, I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe and leave a like. It means more than you know. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something simple when someone wrongs you deeply. Do you believe in confronting them directly, or do you think patience and silence are the more powerful response? Drop your answer in the comments. I'd love to hear where you stand. One thing to note, some elements of this story have been shaped for the purposes of storytelling, and any resemblance to specific real people or events is purely coincidental. What matters most is the truth at the heart of it. Gerald Whitland, 73 years old, and until 7 days ago, I thought I still had a family. Loretta's funeral reception took place at our main estate, a vast rambling property in the Virginia countryside where the two of us had built our life over 4 decades. The rooms were suffused with the cloying perfume of white orchids and the low, careful murmurs of corporate acquaintances performing their grief for a business titan they had admired from a distance. I sat in the corner of the grand living room with a weight on my chest that no word I know does justice to. And while I sat there barely able to breathe, my children were already picking the carcass clean. Preston, my eldest, had positioned himself near the fireplace, a glass of expensive bourbon loose in his hand, sharing quiet laughs with a ring of investors. He carried himself not like a son in mourning, but like a man who had just been told the kingdom was his. Down the hallway, Nadine was in a close huddle with her husband Kurt. I stood and watched, silently disbelieving, as Kurt moved a digital laser measure along the mahogany walls of the home office, barking at a contractor over the phone about opening up the space into some kind of entertainment room. And Vanessa, my daughter-in-law, was making her slow way through the formal dining room with the unhurried patience of a bird of prey. She lifted Loretta's antique crystal decanters one by one, turned each over to read the maker's marks underneath, and entered whatever she found into her phone. Not one of them walked over, not one word of concern, not a hand on my shoulder. I was furniture to them, as unremarkable and forgettable as the wallpaper behind me. In their minds, I had always been nothing more than Loretta's appendage, the quiet man who puttered about in the greenhouse while his formidable wife ran a corporate empire, the family joke, a lucky gardener who had married above himself. What Preston and Nadine never knew, what nobody alive knew, except Loretta, was the real story beneath that empire. 40 years ago, I liquidated my own thriving logistics company for a considerable sum and used every dollar of it to drag Loretta's family business back from the brink of total collapse. I was the one who steadied the ship, built the infrastructure, laid the ground that would eventually bear a $30 million enterprise. Then, I stepped away by choice. I handed her the CEO title and watched from the wings because her success was more than enough for me. Titles meant nothing. Recognition meant nothing. She was what mattered. But staring at my children across that room, I saw clearly what my years of quiet had produced: two people gorged on unearned confidence, utterly blind to where they had come from. 2 days on, we all convened in the grand dining room for the will reading. The estate lawyer, precise, effectless, the kind of man who treats grief as an administrative inconvenience, occupied the head of the long oak table, squaring his papers into neat alignment. Preston and Nadine sat opposite me, their spouses pressed in, close behind their chairs, the way spectators crowd a ringside. I sat by myself, hands flat on the polished surface, still in the black suit I'd worn to bury my wife. The lawyer read. The language was dense and slow, but the meaning arrived fast enough. The full $30 million apparatus corporate holdings, vehicle fleet city penthouses. The primary estate split down the middle, 50-50, between Preston and Nadine. Asset by asset, name by name, and with each one, another degree of warmth crept into my children's expressions. When the city penthouses were announced, Vanessa made a sound, a bright, involuntary squeal she didn't bother to suppress. Then the lawyer stopped. He looked at me over the rims of his glasses. To my husband, Gerald, the will read, "I leave my deepest gratitude and the sealed envelope currently held in the possession of this law firm." He reached into his briefcase and pushed a worn, dusty manila envelope across the table in my direction. Against all those clean official documents, it looked almost embarrassing. I set my palm over it. The texture of that old paper and the silence of that room felt like a taunt. Preston's laugh came sharp and short, the laugh of a man scoring a point. He tilted back in his chair, working the ice around in his glass. "A dusty envelope," he said, amused with himself. "Well, Dad, I guess Mom knew you wouldn't know what to do with real money anyway. You always were more comfortable playing in the dirt." Nadine came in behind him, her voice wrapped in the kind of sympathy that costs nothing. "Don't worry, Dad. We are not going to leave you destitute. Preston and I talked about it. We can offer you a $1,000 monthly allowance. You can use it to rent a nice little apartment somewhere quiet, but you will need to vacate the master suite by the end of the week. Kurt and I are planning to bring in interior decorators, and your gardening boots are ruining the carpets." I took in the four of them, the breathtaking nerve of it, the total clinical absence of anything human. $1,000 a month dispensed like a tip in the house my money had raised by the children my hands had raised. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't shed a tear. Something shifted inside me. The grief didn't leave, but a cold and absolute lucidity moved in beside it. I picked up the envelope, slipped it into my coat, and got to my feet. No speech, no parting shot. I simply left them to it. I walked out of that dining room and let them have their moment. The real work had quietly begun. I had assumed grief would buy me a week to think, but greed keeps its own schedule. Fewer than 48 hours after the lawyer had read Loretta's final words, I was in the greenhouse tending her prized orchids, the one corner of that estate where I could still feel her beside me. The glass doors rolled open. Nadine came in first, Kurt a step behind. She was dressed for somewhere else, entirely picking her way through the humid space with barely concealed revulsion. Kurt produced a folded white document and held it out until I set down the watering can and took it. A 30-day eviction notice signed and legally binding. "We changed our minds about the timeline," Nadine said, arms folded tight across her chest. "The real estate market is incredibly hot right now, and we want to flip the estate before the winter season hits. 30 days is the legal minimum, but honestly, it would be better for everyone if you were gone by the weekend. We have staging companies coming in, and having you lurking around the property is just going to complicate the aesthetic." I read it, black type on white paper undoing 4 decades in a paragraph. They were evicting their mourning father from the home he had built so they could turn a faster profit. Kurt settled back against one of the wooden workbenches, a thin smirk arranging itself on his face. "Look at it this way, Gerald. It is a fresh start. We will wire the first 1,000 allowance to your checking account once you hand over the keys." I studied Nadine's face. I was looking for the child who used to ride on my shoulders on clear nights, arm outstretched toward whatever star caught her eye. She wasn't there. What looked back at me was smooth and closed and entirely mercenary. I folded the notice into my pocket. No argument, no appeal. Debating with people like that is a transaction that costs you more than them. I moved past them both out through the greenhouse and climbed the stairs to the master bedroom. From the top shelf of the closet, I brought down an old canvas duffel bag. The expensive suits stayed. The luxury watches Loretta had given me over the years stayed. I put in clothes enough for a few days, my shaving kit, and the framed photograph of my wife. I zipped the bag, lifted it, and went back down the staircase. Preston was waiting in the foyer below, watching my descent with undisguised pleasure. "Leaving so soon, old man?" he called out as I reached the bottom. "Don't forget to leave your house keys on the console." I set the brass keys on the marble table. The sound carried all the way down that hollow hallway. Then I went out the front door and followed the driveway to the road, their laughter trailing me off the porch. They were certain of what they were seeing, a beaten old man walking away from the fight. They could not have been more wrong. Without knowing it, they had just given me every justification I would ever need. Darkness had settled by the time I lowered myself onto the thin mattress of a cheap motel on the edge of town. A neon sign outside threw restless jumping light through the window and across the curling wallpaper. The quiet pressed in from all sides, nothing like the house I had left that same morning. I set the canvas duffel bag down, pulled the wobbly desk chair out, and sat. Then I reached into my coat and took out the dusty manila envelope. The hands that had held steady when my children slid an eviction notice across to me were now shaking. I cracked the old wax seal, lifted the flap, and tipped the contents out onto the desk. A heavy brass vault key, a small black security token, and a single sheet of thick parchment. Loretta's handwriting, that sweeping distinctive script I would know anywhere, looked back at me from the page. Seeing it open something in me I had been holding shut all day. The note was brief. It read, "I always knew what they were becoming. I just did not want to believe. If you are reading this in a dusty envelope, it means they failed my final test. They took the shiny objects and cast you aside. But you and I built this together, Gerald. The shell is theirs, but the soul is yours. This is for the man who always loved me truly." On the reverse side of the sheet, a string of letters and numbers, an offshore account routing code, a portal address, and a phone number for a Mr. Caldwell. I drew my laptop from my bag, connected it to the motel's faltering internet, and navigated to the secure portal. The black security token handled authentication. My heart was hammering as the screen worked through its loading. When the dashboard finally resolved, I pulled off my glasses and pressed my knuckles to my eyes. I was certain I was reading it wrong. What the screen showed me was not a modest payout or a retirement reserve set aside for a loyal husband. It was the overarching parent trust. Before her death, Loretta had executed a maneuver so precise and so quietly devastating that our children never saw it coming. She had given Preston and Nadine the operational shell of the company, the desks, the employee contracts, the vehicles, the brand. What they did not receive was the substance underneath it. The documents glowing on my screen told the full story. I was the sole owner of the parent holding company. Every patent underpinning the company's intellectual property was mine. The deeds to the corporate headquarters downtown, the factories, the warehouses, all held in my name. And sitting entirely beyond my children's reach in the liquid asset accounts was $150 million. Loretta had effectively made them my tenants. They were running a business that depended on licensing the patents and occupying the buildings from a trust whose existence they had never suspected. A trust that answered to me alone. They believed they had walked away with a $30 million empire. What they had actually inherited was an enormous liability, an operational shell with no ground beneath it, and me holding every key that kept it standing. I settled back in that cheap motel chair, the laptop screen the only real light in the room. The grief that had been immobilizing me began to shift slowly, steadily into something colder and more purposeful. My children thought they had stripped the last of my dignity when they handed me that envelope and showed me the door. They had looked at my quiet nature and read it as surrender. They had confused a lifetime of gentleness with an incapacity to fight. I looked at Loretta's photograph on the nightstand and made her a promise I would guard everything we had truly built together, and I would make Preston and Nadine understand the weight of what they had done. Pale morning light forced its way through the thin motel curtains and stretched across the faded carpet. I woke with the dull ache a cheap mattress deposits in a man's bones overnight. My mind, though, was clearer than it had been in years. The bathroom was narrow and smelled of bleach and old smoke. I ran the water cold and let it shock the last of the haze from my face. A 73-year-old widower cast out of his own home. That was the fact of my situation. But standing at that mirror, I felt nothing like a man who had been beaten. I felt like a soldier at the edge of a battlefield, waiting for the fog to lift. My stomach gave a low growl, reminding me I hadn't had a real meal since the morning of Loretta's funeral. I pulled on a pair of slacks and a button-down shirt, the clothes of a man determined to keep his dignity intact, and stepped out into the sharp morning air. A small corner diner down the block had a buzzing neon sign promising hot coffee and fresh eggs. Before going in, I stopped at the standalone ATM, bolted to the brick wall near the entrance. I slid in my worn debit card, the one tied to the joint account Loretta and I had maintained for 40 years, the one I used for greenhouse supplies, groceries, and anniversary gifts. I entered my PIN and pressed to withdraw $60, enough for breakfast, and something later in the day. The screen spun a small loading circle, then issued a sharp beep. Transaction declined. Contact your financial institution. I assumed I'd hit a wrong key. My fingers were stiff in the cold. I canceled, started again, and dropped the request to $20. Another beep, louder card, suspended account, frozen. A hard knot formed behind my sternum. I took out my phone, dialed the bank's automated line, and worked through the prompts. When the system read my account status back to me, the words arrived like something physical. Accounts frozen by order of the estate executive pending legal review. Preston, my eldest son. The boy I had steadied on a bicycle seat with my hand at his back. The young man whose college tuition I had covered in full term after term, he was now the estate executive, and he had deployed that authority to cut off my personal savings. The logic was not difficult to follow. No money meant hunger and mounting panic. Hunger and panic meant a phone call. A phone call meant me dialing his number, voice unsteady, asking no begging for the $1,000 monthly allowance he had dangled at the reading of the will table like a tip for a waiter. He wanted me back at the estate, pride dissolved, willing to trade whatever remained of my self-respect for a few crumbs from the empire I had quietly constructed for them. A dry, involuntary laugh pushed out of me and disappeared into the street noise. Preston had always been formidable in a boardroom, but he had never learned to read the people closest to him. He saw that I favored the quiet of the greenhouse over the noise of corporate combat, and concluded I was incapable of the other thing. He had no knowledge of how 40 years earlier I had methodically taken apart my own competitors to build a logistics company from nothing, a company I eventually sold to rescue his mother's legacy. He had mistaken my chosen stillness for the only gear I had. When Loretta and I first found each other, neither of us had anything to show but drive and a shared picture of what life might become. Her family's business was drowning in debt. She had the vision and the mind to take it global. She only lacked the capital. I provided that capital. I sold my firm and stepped back so she could step forward, and I never once regretted the trade. Preston and Nadine grew up in a world of comfort that Loretta and I had forged through years of terrifying risk and very little sleep. They never witnessed the late nights, the razor-thin margins, the quiet sacrifices made, so they would never feel the cold grip of financial fear. Because they had never been tested, they had concluded they were untouchable, that the wealth bore their names simply because they bore ours. I took the debit card from my pocket and snapped it cleanly in two. I dropped the pieces in a nearby trash can, turned my back on the diner, and let the hunger sit where it was. I had no interest in their scraps. I made my way back toward the motel at a measured, unhurried pace. No panic. No reaching for the phone to plead for access to my own money. I went straight back to the room, settled at the wobbly laminate desk, and drew Loretta's parchment sheet from my coat pocket. I smoothed the creases flat and ran a finger along the familiar curve of her handwriting. Just below the offshore routing numbers on the back of the note was a name and a direct line, Mr. Caldwell. I did not know much about Mr. Caldwell, but I knew Loretta. Loretta never left anything to chance. If she had entrusted this man with the overarching parent trust, the very soul of our family empire, then he was someone who understood both discretion and power. I picked up my phone and dialed the number. It rang twice before a deep, unhurried voice came on the line, identifying itself as Caldwell speaking. I steadied my voice, fixed my eyes on the peeling motel wallpaper, and told him my name was Gerald Whitland and that I was Loretta's husband. A brief pause followed, not confusion, but the weighted silence of respectful recognition. He addressed me as Mr. Whitland, his tone shifting into one of absolute professional loyalty, and said he had been expecting my call. He told me he was deeply saddened by Loretta's passing, that she had been an extraordinary woman. I thanked him and kept my voice level. I told him she had left me a note, a key, and an offshore account that appeared to hold the parent trust for the entire corporate structure. I explained that my children believed they had inherited everything, and that they had already moved to freeze my personal checking accounts to bring me to heel. On the other end of the line, I could hear the faint scratch of a pen against paper. Mr. Caldwell remarked on the arrogance of youth, with a tone that was dry and entirely unsurprised. He explained that Loretta had anticipated exactly this kind of move against my surface assets, which was the precise reason she had structured the trust as she had. He confirmed that my children were presently running an operational shell that owed its very existence to the patents and properties now under my control. I told him I needed to sit across from him and understand the full dimensions of what my wife had placed in my hands. I needed to be certain my children would not see the blow coming until there was no time left to sidestep it. Mr. Caldwell did not question my resolve. He did not counsel patience or suggest family mediation. He grasped the situation completely. He told me a secure vehicle was already en route to my location and that we would meet at his private office because there was a great deal of work ahead of us and a formal empire to claim. I ended the call and watched the screen go dark in my palm. The hunger that had been gnawing at me all morning had vanished entirely, replaced by a cold and concentrated focus. My children wanted to see how long I could last without them. They were about to discover how quickly they would unravel without me. A black town car appeared at the motel exactly 15 minutes after I put down the phone. The driver asked neither my name nor my destination. He simply swung the rear door open and stood aside while I settled into the plush leather seat. We pulled away from the cracked asphalt and stuttering neon of the city's edge, and as we drove, I watched the towers of glass rise ahead of us on the skyline. Those buildings were the physical expression of the empire Loretta and I had assembled through decades of disciplined work. We did not stop at the gleaming high-rise that housed my children's newly claimed operational headquarters. Instead, the driver threaded the car through a narrow side alley and descended into a subterranean private garage beneath an older, unassuming building deep in the financial district. Mr. Caldwell's private office did not announce itself with a flashy exterior designed to impress. He operated where genuine quiet power has always lived, in secured fortified rooms entirely out of the public's sight. A keycard elevator carried me directly from the garage to a private floor above. When the polished steel doors opened, a tall, immaculately dressed man was already standing in the foyer to receive me. He had sharp gray eyes and the composed, unshakable bearing of someone who moved billions before most people had finished their morning coffee. He extended his hand and gripped mine with a firm, grounding respect I had not felt from anyone since Loretta died. He introduced himself properly, then led me down a quiet corridor into a vast oak-paneled office walled with thick legal volumes and secure filing cabinets. At the center of his mahogany desk sat a heavy steel lockbox. I reached into my coat and laid out Loretta's parchment sheet, the brass vault key, and the small black security token. Mr. Caldwell examined each item with a slow, deliberate nod and positioned them beside the lockbox. Then he looked at me with unmistakable sincerity and said that Loretta was the most brilliant corporate strategist he had ever had the privilege of advising, but that she was also a woman who loved her husband more than anything else in the world. He told me that what my children had put me through over the preceding 48 hours was exactly what Loretta had feared, and it was exactly what she had spent years preparing for. I lowered myself into the heavy leather chair across from his desk, the accumulated exhaustion of the past few days pressing down on me for just a moment. I asked him to explain in plain terms precisely what I was now holding. Mr. Caldwell unlocked the steel box with my brass key and lifted out a thick, heavily annotated file. He explained that the company my children were currently managing, the one they had been toasting like lottery winners, was nothing more than a hollow operational shell. They controlled the employee payroll, the day-to-day marketing budgets, and the fleet of leased corporate vehicles. But they did not own the soul of the enterprise. Loretta had legally separated the intellectual property from the operational branch 5 years ago through a series of highly classified corporate maneuvers. I now held the exclusive patents to every software system, every manufacturing process, and every piece of proprietary technology the company depended on to generate its revenue. Beyond that, I held the ironclad deeds to all the physical real estate, the massive corporate headquarters downtown, where Preston was currently issuing orders, the regional distribution centers, and the city penthouses that Vanessa was already measuring for new Italian marble floors. Every one of them belonged to my overarching parent trust. The full weight of it settled over me slowly, like something vast and heavy lowering itself into place. Mr. Caldwell leaned forward, his voice dropping to a low, serious timbre. He told me my children were legally obligated to pay substantial licensing fees and monthly rent to the parent trust I now controlled. For years, Loretta had quietly forgiven those debts on the back end to keep operations running without friction. But the contracts had never been dissolved. They were fully active and entirely enforceable. If I chose to call in those debts today, their company would be insolvent before the month was out. They believed they had inherited a $30 million empire. In reality, they had inherited a suffocating liability. I was their landlord, their licensor, and their absolute financial master. The $150 million sitting in the offshore liquid accounts was simply the amassed capital of the true empire, held safely beyond the reach of their ambitions. I asked him why she had built it this way, why she had kept something this enormous from even me until after she was gone. Mr. Caldwell steepled his fingers, a genuine shadow of sorrow moving across his face. He reminded me of a conversation Loretta and I had shared late one night in our home office about 3 years ago. We had been going over the quarterly reports when we noticed a pattern of troubling discrepancies in the company's regional expansion accounts. We had begun to suspect that Vanessa and Kurt, our children's spouses, were quietly siphoning company funds into concealed offshore accounts to sustain lifestyles they had no legitimate means to afford. Vanessa had suddenly begun purchasing $250,000 sports cars, and Kurt was taking reckless, unsanctioned risks on speculative real estate, disguising the financial hemorrhage as aggressive market expansion. Preston and Nadine were either too blind to see what was happening or too proud to admit it. Loretta had known her health was deteriorating long before the doctors made it official. She understood that once she was gone, Vanessa and Kurt would waste no time pressing Preston and Nadine to liquidate the company, cash out the assets, and dismantle the legacy the two of us had spent 40 years constructing from nothing. The dusty, unassuming envelope was Loretta's final and definitive loyalty test for our children. She wanted to see whether they would stand guard over the family legacy or surrender completely to the greed that had taken root around them. Had they treated me with the love and dignity a grieving father deserved, had they kept me in the family home and sought my counsel during the transition, I would have opened that envelope willingly and brought them into the parent trust. We would have steered the wealth forward together, but by casting me into the street like something disposable and freezing my modest savings to coerce my surrender, they confirmed precisely what Loretta had feared them capable of becoming. They had failed that test in the most spectacular and pitiless way imaginable. A heavy silence settled over the oak-paneled office. The wound of my children's betrayal was still raw and bleeding somewhere deep in my chest, but it was now held in check by a stronger overriding sense of obligation to the woman I had buried. I looked at the lawyer and asked what our first counter-move should be. Mr. Caldwell's smile came slowly calculated, deliberate, and entirely predatory. He said my children were currently operating under the intoxicating delusion that their power was absolute and unchecked. At this very moment, they were in all likelihood securing massive personal loans against the corporate headquarters without the faintest idea that they held no deed to the building. He strongly advised against an immediate full-scale assault. Reveal my hand too early, and they might scramble to shield their personal assets before we could reach them. Instead, he proposed sending a quiet, routine legal notice of default for back rent to their corporate shell. It would land in the mail looking like unremarkable administrative paperwork. In their current state of flushed, arrogant triumph, they would almost certainly ignore. It write it off as a clerical error from some forgotten vendor, or a minor nuisance to be batted away by the accounting department. That arrogant dismissal would become the legal snare we needed to draw the rope tight. Once they ignored the formal notice, they would be in breach of contract, handing us the legal high ground to strip away everything they believed they owned. I gave a firm nod, feeling the last remnant of the helpless, grieving widower dissolve. I told Mr. Caldwell to draft the default notice at once. My children had chosen to play a game of cold, unsparing greed against an old man they took for powerless. They had not reckoned with the fact that they were challenging the man who actually owned the board. While I sat in that quiet office mapping out a precise surgical strike against their greed, my children were busy raising castles on sand. The view from the upper floor of the corporate headquarters was extraordinary, a wide sweeping panorama of the city skyline that Loretta and I had purchased 2 decades ago. Preston stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows, a crystal glass of rare single malt whiskey held loosely in his hand. He gazed down at the city streets below with the supreme satisfaction of someone who believed he had taken the world without ever having to fight for it. Then he turned back to face the long mahogany boardroom table where a team of private wealth bankers sat, with briefcases open and pens poised. He was negotiating a $50 million personal line of credit offering as collateral the very building beneath his feet. The lead banker, sharp-faced, tailored, hungry for the business of a new generation, praised Preston's visionary leadership and slid a thick set of loan agreements across the polished table. He mentioned almost in passing that the compliance department would need to run a routine title verification on the real estate asset's standard procedure for a loan of this size. Preston dismissed it with a wave of his hand, his hubris a complete blindfold. He announced loudly that the estate had just cleared probate and that he and his sister were the sole heirs to the Whitland Empire. He picked up a heavy silver fountain pen and signed his name with a sweeping flourish on the line, demanding a personal guarantee. He had no idea he was pledging his own financial future against a building he had absolutely no legal claim to. Across town, Nadine and her husband Kurt were equally consumed with spending money they didn't possess. A salt breeze moved through Nadine's hair as she stood on the teak deck of a gleaming 85-foot luxury motor yacht, a floating palace with a private chef's kitchen and a rooftop jacuzzi. The yacht broker was conducting the full tour, pouring expensive Prosecco and treating them like visiting royalty. Kurt moved through the vessel with his chest out, running his palm over the premium finishes and boasting about the sweeping renovations they had planned for the family estate. Nadine didn't trouble herself to negotiate the staggering $8 million price tag. She produced a freshly issued corporate credit card tied directly to the operational shell's primary accounts and authorized a massive seven-figure down payment without blinking. She laughed as the transaction cleared a light, careless sound that carried across the marina. Leaning against the polished railing with her Prosecco, she joked loudly to Kurt that their father was probably hunched over a table in some dingy diner counting his change. They raised their glasses to a brilliant future utterly blind to the fact that the very credit lines they were draining were about to be abruptly recalled by the true owner of the board. Meanwhile, Vanessa, my daughter-in-law, had turned the city's most exclusive shopping corridor into her private playground. She moved between boutiques trailed by eager sales associates, her arms filling with bags of diamond jewelry, designer clothing, and rare leather goods. She was running corporate funds through the register, with a recklessness that crossed into mania. She operated on the assumption that the operational shell poured out pure profit with no overhead pulling against it. She had no grasp of the intricate web of licensing fees, patent royalties, and property leases that Loretta and I had constructed with such precision over the years. Vanessa was financing her indulgences with money that was by law owed to my parent trust. Back at the executive suite, Preston had settled behind Loretta's old desk, his expensive Italian leather shoes propped up on the pristine surface. His assistant entered carrying a silver tray, stacked with the day's correspondence, glossy magazines, charity gala invitations, pitches from investment houses, and resting quietly among them, a plain white envelope. No bold logos, no urgent red lettering, just a standard piece of mail from an unassuming legal firm in the financial district. Inside was the formal notice of default for back rent, the silent lethal trap that Mr. Caldwell had assembled just hours before. Preston barely cast an eye over the pile. He was deep in the planning stages of a lavish corporate restructuring party he intended to host before the month was out, a formal introduction of himself and Nadine as the industry's new powers. He swept his arm across the desk, sending the entire stack, plain white envelope, and all tumbling into the pending tray. He instructed his assistant to pass the dull paperwork to the accounting department, then told her to focus every effort on securing the city's most expensive catering service for his celebration. He poured a fresh measure of champagne, tilted back in the heavy leather chair, and let his eyes fall shut in pure, untroubled satisfaction. They had surrounded themselves with flattering advisors, luxury brokers, and eager bankers. They were assembling an empire of debt on a foundation of pure vapor. They were signing personal guarantees, commingling company funds with private extravagances in ways that constituted corporate fraud, and leveraging assets they had no legal ownership of. They felt invincible, untouchable, but genuine power doesn't need to parade on a yacht or hold court in a boardroom. Genuine power waits quietly in the background, holding the master deed patient for the right moment to turn the lock. I sat across from Mr. Caldwell in his still mahogany-lined office, the faint rhythm of a grandfather clock marking the time in the corner. He slid a crisp document across the desk toward me, the formal notice of default demanding immediate payment of 6 months of back rent and retroactive licensing fees for the proprietary software. The operational shell depended on every single day. The numbers were staggering, totaling over 15 million. Mr. Caldwell settled back in his chair and laced his fingers together carefully. He cautioned me that if my name appeared on this document at this stage, Preston and Nadine would retain aggressive litigators within the hour. They would file injunctions, haul the estate into probate court for years, and allege that Loretta had lacked the mental capacity to structure the parent trust as she had. They would pursue a war of attrition, betting I would exhaust my energy or my resources before the full truth could be enforced. I studied the document and slowly shook my head. I told him a drawn-out courtroom campaign was not what I wanted. I wanted a swift, decisive, and absolute conclusion. I instructed him to bury my identity beneath the corporate veil of the holding company, The notice was to go out from a faceless financial entity, an anonymous corporate landlord, simply calling in its contractual rights. I knew my children with a clarity no one else could claim. If they saw my name on that paper, they would come at me like cornered wolves because they were convinced I was weak. But if they saw a dry bureaucratic demand from an unnamed corporate entity, they would dismiss it without a second thought. Their arrogance would do the rest. Across the city, the quiet machinery of the trap began to turn. In the brightly lit accounting wing of the operational headquarters, a senior financial controller named Frank sat at his desk, eyes fixed on the white envelope that had finally filtered down from Preston's executive suite. Frank was a precise, devoted man who had worked shoulder to shoulder with Loretta for 20 years. He knew those numbers the way a surgeon knows anatomy. As he read through the notice of default, every trace of color left his face. He recognized the name on the letterhead immediately. It was the untouchable parent trust that Loretta had always shielded with absolute secrecy. Frank snatched the document from his desk and rode the elevator straight to the top floor. He'd walked past the receptionist without a word and knocked hard on the heavy glass doors of the boardroom. Preston and Nadine were inside, laughing over a spread of architectural blueprints for their redesigned executive offices. Vanessa and Kurt were lounging on the plush leather sofas, flipping through luxury real estate brochures, mapping out their next round of extravagant purchases. Frank stepped into the room, holding the notice the way a man holds a lit fuse. He cut through their laughter and told them flatly that they had a financial emergency on their hands. He placed the notice of default on the polished boardroom table and laid it out plainly. The operational shell had breached its core lease agreements. Unless $15 million was wired to the holding company within 72 hours, the shell would lose access to the building and every proprietary patent it relied upon. Preston picked the paper up and skimmed it with a look of deep irritation. He rolled his eyes at the senior accountant and told Frank he was being absurd. Preston insisted the holding company was nothing more than a relic of his mother's outdated corporate architecture, an old tax arrangement she had put in place decades ago. As far as he was concerned, since he and Nadine now owned the company, they effectively owned the holding firm as well. Wiring $15 million to themselves was simply shifting money from one pocket to another, and he had no intention of tying up liquid capital in pointless administrative theater while they were trying to secure major personal lines of credit. Nadine leaned over and glanced at the document, tapping her perfectly manicured nails against the heavy paper. She sided completely with her brother. She told Frank this was precisely why they needed a younger, more aggressive accounting team. He was stuck in the past, she said, just feed the notice into the shredder and move on. Kurt called out from the sofa with a loud laugh, suggesting it was probably a phishing scam or a glitch buried somewhere in the automated billing software. Frank made one final attempt. He pleaded with Preston, explaining that the holding company was an entirely separate legal entity, and that letting a formal default notice go unanswered could set off a catastrophic chain of asset seizures. Preston rose from his chair and leaned across the table, fixing Frank with a cold, hard stare. He told the accountant that the next time he barged into a board meeting over a clerical error, he could start clearing out his desk. Preston grabbed the notice of default, crushed it into a tight ball, and dropped it into the brushed aluminum wastebasket in the corner of the room. Back in the secure subterranean office, a text message arrived from a trusted source inside the building. It was Frank. He had always been fiercely devoted to Loretta, and when I had quietly reached out to him the night before, he had agreed to keep me in the loop. The message was short and brutally clear. It read simply that the notice had been presented and deliberately thrown aside. The trap had officially snapped shut. Mr. Caldwell poured 2 glasses of sparkling water and slid one across the desk toward me. He lifted his glass in a quiet, wordless toast. By legally brushing off the notice of default, my children had surrendered their right to a standard legal grace period. They had officially defaulted on their core operational contracts. The banks and lenders who had extended them millions in personal credit had no idea that the collateral underpinning those loans was now legally worthless. My children were driving at 100 miles an hour straight toward a cliff, and they had just proudly cut their own brake lines. The legal snare was perfectly set, and the countdown to their total ruin had officially begun. 3 days after that crumpled notice landed in the wastebasket, the financial guillotine finally dropped. Preston was sitting inside a luxury car dealership, running his hands across the steering wheel of a sports car that cost more than most people's homes. He was waiting for the dealership manager to bring out the final leasing paperwork. Instead, his phone buzzed with an urgent call from his lead private wealth banker. Preston answered with his usual arrogant drawl, fully expecting an update on his $50 million line of credit. The voice on the other end carried none of the warm, fawning tone the banker had used just a week before. The banker informed Preston that their compliance department had completed a rigorous title check on the corporate headquarters. They had found that the operational shell held no deed to the building. Beyond that, they had determined that all intellectual property, the software, the manufacturing patents, was exclusively owned by an external parent trust. The bank had frozen every pending loan immediately. Preston felt the blood drain from his face as the banker stated without any warmth that the operational shell was essentially a tenant, with nothing of substance to put up as collateral. Preston pushed back hard, demanding to be connected to a senior vice president. He insisted the estate lawyer had read the will plainly in their favor, and that he was the rightful heir to the entire corporate empire. The banker remained unmoved. A will, he explained, can only transfer assets the deceased personally held at the time of death, and Loretta had moved the deeds and patents into a blind parent trust 5 years ago. The operational shell owned nothing of real value beyond office furniture and leased company vehicles. The banker advised Preston to retain proper legal counsel, then ended the call. Preston stood in the middle of the luxury dealership, his vision going soft at the edges. The gilded image he had projected to the world was dissolving right in front of him. He set the car keys down on a display desk and walked out into the cold street, his mind struggling to grasp how his mother had engineered such a perfectly constructed financial wall. The panic spread like an infection. Across town, Nadine was seated in an upscale furniture showroom, hand-selecting imported marble for her new penthouse. When she handed her corporate card to the sales associate, it came back with a polite apology. Declined. Nadine, certain it was a simple banking error, pulled out 3 different personal credit cards in quick succession. Every one of them was denied. Her phone started chiming relentlessly automated alerts from financial institutions, stacking up one after another. Her yacht broker left a frantic voicemail. The massive 7-figure down payment had bounced entirely. The bank had moved to lock down all corporate accounts tied to the operational shell in order to contain their exposure. The steady river of money had run completely dry. A crushing weight of reality settled over Nadine as she stood in the middle of that crowded showroom, loudly disputing the polite but unyielding sales associate. She threatened to take her business elsewhere, wholly oblivious to the fact that her purchasing power no longer existed. When she stepped outside and listened to the frantic voicemail from her yacht broker, the full gravity of it finally hit her. She was on the hook for millions in personal contracts, and the corporate safety net she had always leaned on was simply gone. She rang Kurt in a blind panic, demanding he find a way out. Kurt tried to talk her down, but his voice carried an unmistakable undercurrent of fear. He knew that the enormous personal loans he had taken out for his speculative real estate plays were tied directly to those corporate accounts. Without that flow of money, they were both staring down the barrel of total personal bankruptcy. Within the hour, all 4 of them converged back at corporate headquarters. The atmosphere in the boardroom bore no resemblance to the triumphant mood that had filled it before. It was thick with raw terror. Preston moved back and forth across the length of the room, his face pale and damp with sweat. He was shouting that the banks were demanding immediate proof of asset ownership, and that every personal line of credit was locked down tight. Nadine sat at the polished table, trembling eyes locked on the alerts flooding her phone. She cried out that the yacht broker was already threatening to sue for breach of contract. Vanessa and Kurt sat on the leather sofas, looking like animals that had run out of room to run. They had built their entire world on the assumption that the company vault had no bottom. Now they were staring at immediate catastrophic default on every lavish personal debt they had accumulated. Kurt stood up and locked the heavy glass doors of the boardroom, so no one from the accounting department could listen in. He crossed to the table and leaned in close to Preston and Nadine. They needed liquid cash by end of day, he said, or their entire way of life was finished. He reminded them that the banks were only freezing the credit lines, the operational shell still held physical assets. Kurt floated a desperate and deeply illegal idea. He proposed they quietly offload a fleet of corporate transport vehicles and liquidate a batch of high-value server equipment through a private overseas buyer he had a connection with. The cash would be routed straight into their personal offshore accounts, bypassing the corporate freeze and covering their most urgent personal debts. Preston hesitated for barely a second. He was well aware that selling company assets to plug personal holes was textbook embezzlement. He knew it was a clear breach of fiduciary duty and outright corporate fraud. But Vanessa jumped in quickly, working his fear against him. She told Preston that if he didn't get the cash in hand immediately, the banks would drag his name through the mud and make him a laughingstock across the financial district. She pressed on his arrogance, reminding him that he was the one in charge and that doctoring the accounting records afterward to disguise the missing assets as a routine depreciation write-off would be easy enough. Nadine dried her tears and threw her full support behind Vanessa, insisting they had no other path forward. Driven by blind panic and a frantic need to keep his image of wealth intact, Preston relented. He opened his laptop and began pushing through the rapid liquidation of the company fleet and tech servers. He cut around the standard corporate protocols, entirely routing the approvals directly through Kurt and his shadow buyer. They were convinced they were being shrewd, pulling off a clever behind-the-scenes rescue. What they believed was a brilliant liquidity solution, they had no idea was something else entirely. Every digital authorization they processed was being automatically mirrored to the overarching parent trust. In my quiet hotel suite, I watched the alerts surface one by one on my secure portal. My children were building a documented record of their own corporate treason in real time. They had crossed well past reckless mismanagement. They had stepped fully into criminal fraud, and in doing so, they had handed me the precise weapon I needed to strip away everything they had claimed as theirs. I dressed the part they expected to see. I set aside the fine wool suits Loretta had chosen for me in London and went to the back of the closet in my hotel room. I pulled out my faded chino trousers, a worn chambray shirt, and the scuffed work boots I kept for working in the greenhouse. I needed to look exactly like the defeated, helpless old man they had decided I was. I needed them to feel completely untouchable, so their true nature would pour out with nothing holding it back. I tucked my phone into my breast pocket with the microphone clear of any obstruction and took a taxi to the downtown financial district. The corporate headquarters stood like a monument to modern wealth. Towering panels of reflective glass climbed up into the overcast sky. I pushed through the heavy revolving doors and entered the sprawling lobby. The floors were cut from pristine white marble, and the air carried the scent of expensive cologne and fresh espresso. Men and women in tailored suits moved past me in every direction, their eyes sliding straight over my worn clothes as though I were no more than a scuff mark on those immaculate walls. I moved slowly toward the main reception desk, letting my shoulders cave and my steps grow heavy. I was playing a broken man with nothing left to bargain with. The receptionist, a young woman with a sleek headset and a look of finely practiced indifference, glanced up as I drew near. She hadn't even formed her first question when the private executive elevator chimed across the lobby. The polished doors parted, and Preston strode out. Two visibly uneasy vice presidents flanked him, but his face was drawn tight with barely controlled panic. The bank's credit freeze had clearly been eating at him. He had a thick stack of files pressed against his chest and was firing instructions at his subordinates as he walked. Then he turned his head and found me standing at the reception desk. He stopped cold. Whatever panic had been living on his face collapsed instantly into a mask of pure, unfiltered rage. He passed the files off to one of the vice presidents and crossed the marble floor toward me with long, deliberate strides. I eased my hand into my breast pocket and quietly pressed the record button on my phone. The trap was set. "What are you doing here?" Preston's voice came out low and tight with fury. "You're embarrassing me. Get out." I kept my head down and let my voice carry a faint, convincing tremble, the wavering tone of a desperate old man with nowhere else to turn. I told him my debit card had been declined at the diner. I had no money for food, I said, and the bank had told me my accounts were frozen. I looked up at him with wide, pleading eyes and asked for the $1,000 monthly allowance he and Nadine had promised me at the reading of the will. I just needed enough to get through the week. Preston held my gaze for a long moment. Then he threw his head back and released a loud, contemptuous laugh. The sound rang up to the high ceiling and bounced back down across the lobby, enough to make employees and executives alike stop and look. He made no effort to lower his voice. If anything, he spoke louder, leaning into the spectacle he was creating. He wanted an audience. He wanted every person in that building to see just how dominant he was, even while he was quietly drowning in debt behind closed doors. On allowance, He let the words drip with mockery, his voice carrying across the marble floor. "You walk into my building dressed like a vagrant and hold your hand out. Did you genuinely think we were going to write you a check every month just for breathing? That was a courtesy, old man. A civil way of getting you to gather your things and leave our property without a scene. You don't collect a pension for tending a garden and riding my mother's coattails." I kept my hands trembling at my sides. I asked him quietly how I was supposed to live. I reminded him that I was his father, that I had raised him, that Loretta would be heartbroken to see him standing here treating me this way. The mention of his mother pushed him past whatever edge remained. He closed the gap between us, driving a manicured finger toward my chest. He announced to the onlooking crowd that I was nothing more than an overpaid gardener. He declared I had contributed absolutely nothing to the $30 million empire he now controlled. He told me Loretta had left me a dusty envelope because that was precisely what my life amounted to: dirt and empty paper. He told me to go find work digging ditches if I wanted to eat, because the Bank of Loretta was closed for good. I looked around the lobby. Dozens of people had stopped watching, murmuring to one another. I had given him every possible opening to show a shred of compassion, some basic human decency. He had chosen instead to humiliate an old man in front of his entire staff to shore up his own crumbling sense of power. My phone was capturing every word of it, every cruel jab, every admission of his moral emptiness. Preston turned toward the heavy mahogany security desk near the entrance. He snapped his fingers sharply, drawing the attention of the two broad-shouldered guards stationed there. He pointed at me with undisguised contempt. He ordered them to remove the vagrant from his lobby at once and made a point of instructing them to put me out on the street and to permanently bar me from ever entering the building again. The guards approached their expressions tight with the kind of discomfort that comes from following an order you know is wrong, but they obeyed the man they believed owned the building. Their heavy hands closed around my arms. I offered no resistance. I didn't raise my voice or make a scene of it. I simply let my shoulders fall and allowed them to walk me the length of that long lobby and out through the glass doors. I was deposited on the cold concrete sidewalk as the morning crowd streamed past without a second glance. I stood at the curb, drew my phone from my breast pocket, stopped the recording, and saved the audio to a secure cloud server. I pulled a pair of wireless earphones from my pocket and played it back. Preston's voice came through with perfect clarity, mocking, sneering, calling me a glorified gardener, talking about starvation as though it were a punchline. I listened to it twice. Whatever residual shadows of paternal guilt had still been living somewhere inside me, whatever faint, stubborn hope that my son was simply lost and not truly gone, all of it dissolved in the cold morning air. The man in that building was not my child. He was a parasite feeding off a legacy he had never earned. My heart stopped aching for him and settled instead into something calm and absolute, a clear, quiet, moral certainty. He had thrown me out of a building I secretly owned, and he had given me every justification I would ever need to bring the hammer down without a single ounce of mercy. What I was about to uncover cut deeper than anything I had prepared myself for. The people I had once loved without condition had made choices I could never have imagined. Before I tell you what that cost all of us, ask yourself this. If someone you trusted completely had been quietly working against you, would you walk away, or would you stay and make sure justice found its way home? I turned away from the glass tower, flagged down a passing taxi, and headed straight back to my lawyer. It was time to bring their counterfeit empire down to rubble. The walls of the executive suite were closing in fast on Preston and Nadine. The sprawling corporate headquarters, which had felt like a grand palace barely a week before, had transformed into a very expensive and suffocating cage. The heavy mahogany phones on their desks had gone quiet from investor congratulations, and were now buzzing without stop under the weight of creditor demands. The hasty fleet liquidation Kurt had pushed through the day before was little more than a drop against the flood of massive personal loans they had taken out to sustain their extravagant lives. Vanessa was pacing the boardroom, in tears, bitterly complaining that her favorite luxury boutique had declined her card in front of her wealthiest circle of friends. Kurt was frantically hitting refresh on his banking apps, watching account after account lock up as financial institutions moved to freeze their assets. Preston sat behind his heavy oak desk, pressing his fingers to his temples in a losing battle against a pounding headache. He had quietly reached out to every legitimate buyer in the city about offloading the main building, but word had already traveled through the financial district that the siblings were entirely toxic. Established banks and corporate buyers needed months of thorough due diligence and exhaustive title searches. They did not have months. They had barely 48 hours before their catastrophic default hit the public record, and financial authorities began asking very uncomfortable questions about the missing company funds. Then his phone lit up with an encrypted message. It was a reply from a shadow broker Kurt had contacted the previous night in a moment of sheer desperation. An overseas investment syndicate was prepared to purchase the corporate headquarters for cash within 24 hours. No drawn-out audits, no public announcements, just a quiet, immediate lifeline. Preston had no way of knowing the syndicate was a shell corporation, one controlled entirely by Mr. Caldwell, and quietly bankrolled through my overarching parent trust. The address the shadow broker provided led them to an unmarked brick building on the far industrial fringe of the financial district. The sky above hung heavy and gray, a fitting match for the bleak mood inside the luxury town car, carrying all four of them. No corporate logos, no welcoming receptionists, no marble fountains greeted them at the entrance. A towering, silent security guard walked Preston, Nadine, Vanessa, and Kurt down a narrow concrete corridor and into a sterile, windowless conference room in the basement. The air in the room carried the faint smell of cold, recycled ventilation and sharp chemical polish. A long stainless steel table filled most of the dim space. Seated at the far end was a man introduced only as Mr. Voss. He wore a severe dark suit and possessed pale eyes that held no trace of warmth or human feeling. He was one of Mr. Caldwell's most ruthless junior partners, selected specifically for his talent at unsettling desperate, arrogant people without ever needing to raise his voice. Preston attempted to hold on to his usual bearing of superior confidence as he entered the room. He puffed his chest out and threw his expensive leather briefcase onto the metal table, declaring loudly that the building was prime real estate and that they were doing the syndicate an enormous favor by bringing it off the open market. Mr. Voss did not blink. He offered no water, no small talk, no courtesy of any kind. He simply laced his fingers together on the table and stated that the syndicate was fully aware of their liquidity disaster and their urgent need for untraceable cash. He then laid out the terms of the acquisition with calm, methodical precision. The syndicate would take the corporate headquarters at 30 cents on the dollar. The cash would land in their personal offshore accounts within 24 hours, enough to silence their private debts immediately and pull their luxury assets back from the edge of repossession. Nadine reacted with a sharp, audible gasp at the deliberately insulting offer, driving her palms down onto the cold table. She snapped that 30 cents on the dollar was outright robbery, and that the building commanded tens of millions more on any legitimate market. Mr. Voss regarded her with a flat, chilling expression, and quietly suggested she try her luck with a traditional bank if she felt confident about the time available to her. He pointed out that any conventional lender would require a full title verification, a process that takes a minimum of 60 days, a luxury he understood perfectly well they did not have. The words title verification were enough to drain the color from Preston's face entirely. He knew that if any legitimate institution looked closely enough, they would find that the parent trust held the actual deeds to the property. Vanessa gripped Preston's arm, her voice stripped raw with panic. She urged him to take the deal right there and then. She reminded him that if their creditors went public, they stood to lose their city penthouses, their imported cars, and whatever remained of their social standing. Kurt echoed her desperation, visibly sweating, as he pressed Preston to accept, arguing that walking away with 30% of something was far better than absorbing 100% of a public bankruptcy. The crushing pressure of their own runaway greed was suffocating them inside that windowless room. Preston looked across the table at his sister. Nadine bit her lip, her earlier defiance crumbling completely beneath the immediate terror of financial ruin. She gave a small, defeated nod. They had to take the money. Mr. Voss reached into his briefcase and drew out a thick stack of legal documents, sliding them deliberately across the cold metal surface. He placed a heavy black pen in front of Preston. In a smooth, level monotone, Mr. Voss explained that, given the highly irregular nature of the expedited cash transfer, the syndicate required complete and unconditional legal indemnity. He mentioned almost in passing that the addendums held standard liability waivers to shield the buyers from any future corporate fallout. He informed them that the documents explicitly stated the sellers were authorizing the sale to cover emergency personal liabilities, and that they fully acknowledged they were bypassing standard corporate board approvals to execute the rapid transfer. Preston paused for one brief flickering moment, pen hovering above the signature line. Some small rational voice buried at the back of his mind almost certainly warned him that he should have his own legal team examine the dense paperwork before signing away a major corporate asset. But blind panic and the intoxicating pull of immediate rescue overwhelmed whatever caution remained. He had no desire to bring his own lawyers into it, because his lawyers would start asking why he was liquidating the primary corporate headquarters to cover Vanessa's maxed credit cards and Kurt's catastrophic real estate losses. He simply wanted the money to make the nightmare disappear and protect his manufactured status. What Preston and Nadine failed to catch buried inside the dense legal language was the fatal poison pill Mr. Caldwell had painstakingly constructed and concealed within the text. The documents did not merely waive their right to pursue the new buyer. They contained specific, carefully worded clauses in which the signatories admitted to commingling corporate funds with their own personal accounts. The addendum explicitly and legally acknowledged the existence and superior claim of my parent trust over the operational shell they had been running. By putting their names to those papers, they were formally confessing under penalty of perjury to gross financial mismanagement, corporate embezzlement, and attempted fraud. They were in effect signing their own arrest warrants and passing them directly to their landlord. Preston pressed the pen to the heavy paper and scratched his name in a frantic, uneven scrawl. He shoved the thick contract across to Nadine. She didn't even make a show of reading the terms. Her hands were trembling so severely she could barely hold the pen, but she scrawled her name directly beneath her brother's. Vanessa and Kurt released a long, shuddering breath of relief, in unison sinking back into their metal chairs, utterly convinced they had just sidestepped a catastrophic financial collapse. They believed foolishly completely that they had outmaneuvered the system and locked in exactly the cash they needed to keep their hollow empire alive for a few more years. Mr. Voss calmly gathered the documents and tapped them squarely against the table. No smile, no handshake. He placed the signed confessions neatly back into his briefcase, rose from his chair, informed them that the funds would be processed according to the precise terms of the agreement, and walked out, leaving them to revel in a victory that would destroy them. Back in my hotel suite, I stood at the window, watching the city skyline fade as evening settled in over the rooftops. My phone gave a soft chime from the coffee table, an encrypted text from Mr. Caldwell. The message read that the assets were fully secured and the confessions were permanently signed in ink. My children had just attempted to sell me a building I already owned using the very money I had provided, and in doing so, they had delivered the absolute, undeniable legal proof of their criminal conduct straight into my hands. The trap was now perfectly complete, and the final phase of their downfall was ready to be set in motion. The morning after that frantic signing in the dark basement conference room, my children arrived at the corporate headquarters with the bearing of conquering royalty. Preston strode through the marble lobby in a brand new bespoke suit, carrying himself as though the suffocating panic of the day before had been nothing but a bad dream. Nadine walked just behind him, clutching an expensive iced coffee, already talking loudly about bringing in a fresh interior design team for her penthouse. They genuinely believed they had beaten the system. They were utterly convinced that the shadowy investment syndicate would wire millions into their personal offshore accounts before sunset, quietly burying their catastrophic debts and letting them go on sustaining their lavish illusion of absolute power. They took the private executive elevator to the top floor and stepped out into the plush reception area. The atmosphere, however, was anything but celebratory. The familiar hum of ringing phones and busy keyboards had been swallowed by a tense, airless silence. Standing in the center of the reception area was a team of 10 sharply dressed men and women, each holding a heavy locked briefcase. They bore no resemblance to eager partners or friendly vendors. They carried the cold, exacting posture of forensic accountants. Preston's arrogant smile faltered for just a fraction of a second before he caught himself, squared his shoulders, and demanded to know who had authorized an unannounced delegation onto his executive floor. The lead auditor, a stern woman with sharp, penetrating eyes, stepped forward. She offered no polite handshake and no deferential greeting. She simply handed Preston a thick, legally binding mandate. In a clear, unhurried voice, she announced that her firm had been formally engaged to carry out an immediate, comprehensive emergency audit of all corporate operations, financial ledgers, and physical assets. Nadine's iced coffee slipped from her grip and hit the pristine carpet, the plastic cup splitting apart and spreading cold brown liquid across the expensive fibers. She stared at the auditors in undisguised terror. Preston snatched the mandate and tore through the dense legal text with frantic eyes. His mind leaped immediately to the explanation that made the most sense to him, that federal tax authorities had flagged the sudden erratic movement of corporate funds and the hasty liquidation of the company fleet. He took it for an aggressive government sweep. He had no idea whatsoever that Mr. Caldwell had personally dispatched this elite team of private forensic auditors on behalf of my overarching parent trust to legally secure the premises before the final confrontation. Preston tried to slow them down, calling on his usual aggressive charm. He announced loudly that the company was in the middle of a sweeping corporate restructuring, and that his accounting team would be delighted to forward any requested digital files before the end of the month. The lead auditor paid his bluster no attention at all. She signaled to her team, and the 10 accountants fanned out instantly across the floor, moving past stunned assistants and walking straight into the financial control rooms. She informed Preston in a flat, even tone that they were not there to request files. They were there to seize all local servers, freeze the operational ledgers, and physically impound every paper record on the premises. That was the moment Preston's confident facade finally shattered. He seized Nadine by the arm, pulled her down the corridor into the main executive suite, slammed the heavy mahogany doors behind them, and twisted the brass lock. He yanked out his phone and dialed Kurt and Vanessa, ordering them upstairs immediately. The four of them were now barricaded inside the very suite they had toasted to inheriting just weeks before. Kurt moved back and forth across the floor, pulling at his hair, muttering that they were completely finished. He knew that any competent auditor who opened the ledgers would see within minutes that the operational shell had been hemorrhaging cash funding, Vanessa's extravagant spending, and his own ruinous real estate gambles. Nadine was hyperventilating against the large glass window, crying that the authorities were going to seize her cars and send them all to federal prison for tax evasion and corporate embezzlement. Preston's eyes landed on the large filing cabinets running along the back wall of the executive suite. Those cabinets held the raw, unredacted paper trails of their personal expenditures, dressed up as corporate write-offs. He made a desperate and thoroughly illegal decision. He went to the corner of the room and switched on the heavy-duty commercial micro-cut shredder. The machine growled to life with a loud, hungry hum. He told Kurt to start pulling files from the cabinets. For the next hour, all four of them engaged in a frantic, wretched exercise in criminal destruction. Vanessa and Nadine tore through the folders, pulling out expense reports, personal luxury receipts, and the hastily printed invoices from the illegal fleet liquidation they had authorized barely 24 hours earlier. They fed thick stacks of paper into the shredder, the machine grinding everything down into tiny, irrecoverable strips of confetti. They were sweating their designer clothes, creasing as they raced to erase the physical evidence of their own limitless greed. They believed they were saving themselves by eliminating the paper trail. What they failed to understand was that their frantic shredding was entirely pointless. In the modern corporate world, every paper record is automatically mirrored to secure off-site digital cloud servers. The forensic auditors working down the hall were already pulling clean digital copies of every document my children were at that very moment trying to physically destroy. By feeding those pages into the shredder, Preston and Nadine were not covering their tracks. They were committing the additional felony of destroying corporate evidence during an active investigation, handing my legal team the final nail they needed. Sitting safely in my hotel suite, I listened to a steady stream of updates from Mr. Caldwell. He told me the auditors had successfully locked down the accounting department and that the security cameras in the executive hallway showed the siblings had barricaded themselves inside the main suite. The sound of the shredder was audible right through the heavy wooden doors. A deep, settled calm came over me. My children were in that room, dismantling their own futures, strip by strip. They had taken the bait, swallowed the hook whole, and were now constructing the very cage that would lock them away for good. The stage was perfectly set for the final act. Morning light bounced off the towering glass walls of the corporate headquarters, throwing long, sharp shadows across the city below. Inside the executive suite, the mood had shifted from frantic terror into a kind of manic, toxic delusion. Having spent hours feeding documents into the shredder, Preston and Nadine had talked themselves into believing they had successfully erased every trace of their financial crimes. In their minds, no paper meant no proof, and without proof they were untouchable once again. Fueled by a desperate need to reassert control, Preston decided that playing defense was a sign of weakness. He was going to go on the offensive. He was going to assert his complete dominance over the company and publicly crush anyone who dared to question his authority. He ordered his assistant to summon every remaining member of the board of directors for an emergency noon meeting. These were not the seasoned loyal advisors who had helped Loretta build the empire from the ground up. Those veterans had been methodically shown the door and replaced by Preston over the preceding weeks. The board now consisted entirely of his personally selected friends, wealthy socialites, and eager hangers-on who owed their prestigious titles and generous stipends to his goodwill. He knew they would ask no difficult questions. He knew they would rubber stamp whatever he said in front of them. Nadine took charge of managing the public story. She spent the morning working through her contacts among the city's most prominent financial journalists, extending personal invitations to the grand lobby of the corporate headquarters for an exclusive press conference. She promised them a major announcement about a sweeping corporate restructuring and the beginning of a bold new chapter for the Whitland Empire. Her plan was to reframe the forensic auditor's aggressive presence as a proactive initiative. She and Preston had launched themselves a forward-thinking effort to modernize the outdated accounting practices inherited from their mother. It was a staggering act of pathological self-delusion. They were genuinely preparing to smile for the cameras and take public credit for the very investigation that was actively uncovering the full scale of their embezzlement. As the clock struck noon, Preston and Nadine walked out of the executive suite and down the corridor toward the grand boardroom. Kurt and Vanessa followed just behind all four of them, moving with their heads high, projecting the image of untouchable wealth and authority. Preston wore a perfectly tailored navy suit, his hair slicked back his jaw, set in a hard, composed line. Nadine had put on a pristine white designer dress, adorned with heavy gold jewelry, every inch of her, staged to look like the portrait of corporate royalty. They moved past the rooms where the forensic auditors were working in quiet concentration, paying no attention whatsoever to the cold reality unfolding just a few feet away. The heavy mahogany doors of the grand boardroom swung open. The long, polished table was ringed with Preston's hand-selected board members, all murmuring uneasily among themselves. Beyond the thick glass walls of the boardroom, the invited journalists had already begun assembling in the adjoining lobby, setting up cameras and uncapping their pens. They watched the powerful heirs settle into their seats, anticipating a showcase of modern corporate authority. Preston walked to the head of the table. He did not sit. He stood with both hands planted firmly on the polished wood and swept the room with a gaze of total, unquestioned command. He pitched his voice loud and final, the tone of a man who expects no argument. He declared that the company was entering a necessary and aggressive period of modernization. He stated explicitly that the auditors currently occupying the building were rogue contractors who had overstepped their authority and created needless panic. With a theatrical sweep of his hand, he announced the auditing firm was terminated effective immediately, trying, in essence, to fire the very people assembling the criminal case against him. The board members nodded along eagerly, wholly unaware of the genuine legal catastrophe developing around them. They murmured their approval, heaping praise on Preston for his bold, decisive leadership. Emboldened by their unthinking loyalty, Preston moved into the second phase of his desperate plan. He nodded to Kurt, who unsnapped his expensive leather briefcase with visible pride and produced a thick stack of freshly printed legal contracts. Kurt distributed them around the table, setting a copy in front of each board member. Preston explained that, given the scale and visibility of the company's restructuring, it was standard corporate protocol to secure the executive transition. He described the documents as routine retention packages designed to provide stability within the leadership team during the transitional period. In reality, the documents were ironclad, golden parachutes of the most brazen kind. Preston and Nadine were demanding that the board legally guarantee them an exit package of $20 million each, payable immediately in the event their positions were ever terminated. They were attempting to drain the last remaining drops of capital from the operational shell, engineering a personal windfall regardless of what became of the business beneath them. Nadine leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table, and turned a warm smile on the board members. She deployed her most persuasive voice, claiming that the Shadow Investment Syndicate had already wired preliminary funds to secure their new ventures. She lied without a trace of hesitation, telling them the company had never been more liquid and that the golden parachutes were a pure formality required by their personal wealth managers. She assured the room that signing the documents was the final step before they launched their bold new chapter together. Vanessa nodded her vigorous support from the sidelines, silently cheering on what amounted to brazen theft. Kurt and Vanessa were far from passive spectators. They were actively working the journalists gathered beyond the glass doors, handing out glossy press folders packed with fabricated financial projections. Vanessa beamed at the cameras and whispered to the reporters that Preston was stepping into his destiny. They were full partners in the fraud, eagerly counting down to the moment the golden parachute funds would clear into their personal accounts. The greed in that room was a living, breathing thing, consuming everyone it touched. The board members turned through the thick contracts. A few of them looked visibly puzzled by the staggering figures and the immediate payout clauses, but not one of them was willing to raise a formal objection against Preston's domineering presence. The cameras flashing intermittently through the glass walls only added to the pressure bearing down on the room. The board members wanted to be on the winning side. They wanted to stay in the good graces of the wealthy heirs who controlled their positions. Preston picked up a heavy silver fountain pen from the center of the table and held it forward. His voice climbed louder, filling the wood-paneled room. He told them to sign the resolutions immediately, making clear he would not tolerate hesitation or disloyalty on a day of such historic significance. He declared himself the undisputed master of the Whitland Empire, announcing that the future belonged entirely to him and his sister. He stood at the head of the table, blinded by his own soaring hubris, genuinely believing he had outmaneuvered the banks, the auditors, and the long shadow of his own mother. The first board member, a wealthy real estate developer, set his pen to the thick paper. The scratch of the ink against the contract seemed to ring out in the tense quiet of the room. One by one, the others followed, signing away tens of millions of dollars the operational shell simply did not have. Preston watched the signatures accumulate with a hungry, predatory satisfaction. A surge of pure adrenaline ran through him. He was convinced he had just legally insulated himself from any future financial collapse. The board members reached for their pens. The journalists outside pressed closer to the glass, eager to file their stories on the aggressive restructuring of the famous logistics empire. Preston and Nadine exchanged a glowing, triumphant look, fully persuaded they had locked in their tens of millions and buried every one of their crimes beneath a mountain of manufactured corporate authority. They felt completely invincible, entirely untouchable. They had no idea at all that their spectacular public performance was only the opening act for their total ruin, or that the true master of the empire was already moving down the hallway toward them. The heavy silver fountain pen in the first board member's hand hovered mere millimeters above the signature line. The air inside the grand boardroom was thick with the intoxicating scent of unearned wealth and unchecked arrogance. Preston stood at the head of the polished mahogany table, practically trembling with triumph, as he watched his hand-picked loyalists prepare to sign away tens of millions of dollars. Beyond the thick glass walls, the invited journalists snapped photographs, steadily capturing what they believed was the glorious coronation of the new corporate king. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the faint hum of the climate control system and the self-satisfied breathing of the heirs. Then the massive double doors of the grand boardroom did not simply open. They were pressed apart with a slow, deliberate, unhurried authority that sent a wave of cold air rolling through the stagnant room. Every head at the table snapped toward the entrance, expecting a breathless catering attendant, or perhaps the shadow investors arriving to close their discreet buyout. Instead, a collective gasp moved around the long table. The man standing in the doorway was no waiter, and he was certainly not some nameless overseas broker. It was me. I bore no resemblance to the broken, grieving widower they had coldly expelled from the family estate. I was no longer wearing the faded chino trousers, worn chambray shirt, and scuffed work boots of a discarded gardener, begging for scraps in the lobby. I was dressed in a flawless charcoal gray bespoke suit that Loretta had commissioned from a master tailor in London 5 years ago. The fabric fell across my shoulders with perfect precision, projecting an aura of quiet, unassailable power. My entire bearing had been transformed. My back was straight, my head was high, and my eyes were fixed on my son, with the cold, unhurried focus of a man reclaiming what was always his. I did not walk into that room alone. Flanking me on my right was Mr. Caldwell, radiating the composed, lethal calm of a legal executioner. He carried no flashy briefcase, only a thick stack of crimson folders resting with apparent ease under one arm. To my left stood the lead forensic auditor, her sharp eyes moving across the panicked faces around the table, two of her senior investigators positioned just behind her. We moved across the thick carpet as one unified force of absolute financial reckoning. For a long, terrible moment, Preston simply stared at me. The smug, triumphant expression drained off his face, replaced by an involuntary twitch working its way along his jaw. His mind was fighting violently to make sense of what it was seeing. He had persuaded himself that I was a pitiful, broken old man, weeping alone in a cheap motel room. Finding me here flanked by the city's most feared corporate attorney and the very auditors he believed he had just dismissed, cracked his carefully constructed reality into sharp, jagged pieces. Nadine released a short, strangled breath and took a physical step backward, her designer heels catching the edge of the leather sofa. Vanessa and Kurt, who had been whispering excitedly to the journalists only moments before, went completely still. Their eyes stretched wide with sudden visceral panic. Preston's shock curdled quickly into an explosive defensive fury. He drove his fist down onto the mahogany table, the crack of it cutting through the room like a shot. He leveled a shaking manicured finger at me, his voice climbing to a hysterical pitch that stripped away every last trace of his carefully maintained executive persona. He demanded to know how I had bypassed security and reached the restricted executive floor. He turned on the board members, shouting at them not to look at me, declaring loudly that I was nothing but his delusional old father, a man grief had driven completely out of his mind. Frantic to hold his authority together beneath the flashing cameras beyond the glass, Preston swung toward the hallway and began roaring for the security guards, demanding they haul the vagrant out of the building at once. Two broad-shouldered guards who had been posted near the elevators came charging into the boardroom, arms outstretched toward me, just as they had the day before in the lobby. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I simply looked at Mr. Caldwell. Mr. Caldwell moved forward, his tailored suit catching the light. He did not yell. His voice never climbed above a measured conversational tone, yet every word landed with the crushing authority of airtight legal supremacy. He raised a single hand, one finger extended, aimed squarely at the two guards. He informed them with quiet precision that if they so much as touched my suit, they would be terminated on the spot, stripped of their pensions, and personally sued for laying hands on the sole legal owner of the very building they were standing in. The guards froze where they stood, hands hanging in the air inches from my arms. They glanced at Preston, then back at Mr. Caldwell, and recognized without question the voice of a man who actually controlled their futures. Slowly and wisely, they retreated 3 full steps and let their arms fall, heads dropping in silence. Preston's face flooded a deep, dangerous shade of crimson. He bent across the table neck veins, standing out screaming that Mr. Caldwell had lost his mind. He declared that he was the chief executive officer, that the will had cleared probate, and that the entire $30 million empire was his. He ordered the board members to ignore the disruption and sign the golden parachute documents, immediately scrambling frantically to lock in his stolen millions before the whole illusion came apart. Mr. Caldwell did not stoop to argue with the hysterical boy. He simply crossed the room in slow, deliberate strides until he reached the center of the massive mahogany table. The board members instinctively pushed their chairs back, unsettled by the man now standing before them. Mr. Caldwell lifted the thick stack of crimson folders high above the table and released them. The heavy legal files crashed onto the polished wood with a thunderous resonant boom that rattled the water glasses and rolled across the high ceilings. The impact was so sharp and final that Nadine actually let out a small, terrified scream. Mr. Caldwell swept his sharp gray eyes around the table, fixing them on every hand-picked sycophant Preston had installed in that room. He informed the board, in a voice laced with legal venom, that the papers they had been hovering over were entirely fraudulent. He stated plainly that Preston and Nadine Whitland did not own the company, did not own the patents, and held no deed to the glass tower surrounding them. He announced to the breathless room that the operational shell they managed was in catastrophic default, owing an immediate $15 million in back rent and licensing fees to the overarching parent trust. He pressed a hand to the crimson folders on the table and declared that the sole absolute authority over that parent trust was standing directly behind him. The silence that fell was suffocating. It was the silence of a great ship finding an iceberg in the dead of night. The board members carefully, deliberately set their heavy silver pens down on the table and slid the golden parachute contracts well away from their hands. The journalists crowded against the glass walls were scribbling furiously, eyes wide with disbelief, understanding they were watching the most significant corporate execution of the decade. Preston stared at the red folders, breath coming in short, shallow bursts. He looked across at me, every trace of arrogance stripped from his face, leaving behind nothing but a frightened, bewildered child. He stammered, demanding to know what kind of sick game I was playing, insisting his mother had left me nothing but a dusty, empty envelope. I finally moved, walking slowly past the trembling board members until I stood directly across the table from my son. I looked into his panicked eyes and let a lifetime of quiet observation settle into my voice. I spoke steadily, making certain every person in that room, including the reporters pressed against the glass, caught every word. I told him his mother had not left me an empty envelope. I told him she had left me the keys to the kingdom because she knew exactly what he would attempt the moment her heart stopped beating. I watched his eyes sweep the room, hunting for an exit, a loophole, any foothold for the dominance he had performed for so long. I leaned slightly across the table, resting my hands on the cool wood, mirroring the posture he had used earlier. Only mine was backed by legitimate, devastating power. I looked at the golden parachute contracts scattered across the surface, and then back at my son. I told him, in a voice as cold as winter ice, that I had not come to plead for a $1,000 allowance. I told him I was the landlord, and I had come to collect the rent. The silence inside that grand boardroom was so complete, I could hear the ragged, frantic breathing of my own children. Preston had both hands clamped around the edge of the mahogany table, knuckles gone white as his mind struggled to absorb the full weight of what I had said. He stared at the thick crimson folders resting on the polished wood as if they were coiled to strike. The journalists pressed against the glass walls were snapping photographs and typing rapidly on their phones, capturing every second of the unfolding collapse. Mr. Caldwell gave my son not one moment to find his footing. The seasoned corporate attorney stepped forward and opened the first crimson folder. The sound of the heavy pages turning rang out like a gavel on its block. Mr. Caldwell began reciting the legal reality in a cold, methodical voice that left no room for interpretation or debate. He announced that the operational shell currently managed by Preston and Nadine Whitland was entirely legally dependent on the overarching parent trust. He laid out how every proprietary software system the company used to track global shipments, every manufacturing patent, and the very logo glowing atop the building were exclusively owned by my holding company. He turned to the next page and stated that the operational shell had been operating under a strict licensing agreement for the past 20 years. Mr. Caldwell looked directly at the trembling board members and spelled out the financial terms precisely. He explained that Loretta had routinely forgiven the substantial quarterly licensing fees on the back end, simply to keep the operational shell looking highly profitable on paper. He then noted with a chilling calm that upon her death, the grace period terminated immediately. The parent trust was now legally bound to collect every outstanding debt. He produced a copy of the plain white envelope, the very notice of default that Preston had carelessly tossed into his office, brushed aluminum wastebasket 3 days earlier. Mr. Caldwell informed the breathless room that because the current chief executive officer had deliberately disregarded a formal legal demand, the operational shell was now in catastrophic breach of contract. He stated the final figure, clearly ensuring the journalists outside could read his lips. The company owed the parent trust an immediate non-negotiable sum of $15 million in unpaid licensing fees and retroactive property rent. Beyond that, he explained, until the debt was settled in full, the operational shell was legally barred from accessing any of the patented software, effectively shutting down all global business operations by midnight. Nadine let out a desperate choking sound. She grabbed the edge of the table, her pristine designer dress looking suddenly and entirely out of place on a woman staring down total financial ruin. She looked at Kurt, her husband whose face had gone completely colorless. The enormous personal loans, the luxury yachts, the designer clothes, all of it financed by a company that was effectively bankrupt and $15 million in the hole. Preston finally broke out of his stunned paralysis. He drove both hands flat onto the table chest, heaving. He shouted that it was all a lie, an elaborate manufactured fabrication. He thrust his trembling finger at me and screamed to the room that I was nothing but a dirt-covered gardener. He yelled that his mother had built the $30 million empire entirely from scratch with her own hands and her own brilliant mind. He insisted I was just a pathetic old man trying to steal a legacy I had played absolutely no part in creating. I stood perfectly still and let the torrent of hysterical insults wash over me. The board members shifted uneasily in their expensive leather chairs, eyes moving between the screaming, arrogant son and the perfectly composed, impeccably dressed father. They were beginning to understand at last who truly held the power in that room. I moved closer to the table, silencing Preston with nothing more than a raised hand. I looked straight into his panicked eyes and told him the time had come for him to learn the true history of the empire he was busy trying to tear apart. My voice was slow and steady, carrying the full weight of 40 years of buried secrets. I told my children that 40 years ago, long before the private jets and the towering glass skyscrapers, their mother was hunched over a kitchen table, weeping over a stack of foreclosure notices. I explained that her family business, the original logistics company she had inherited from her father, was drowning in crippling toxic debt. They were weeks from total bankruptcy, staring at the loss of their homes and everything they had built. I paused, letting those words settle into the stillness of the room. I told them that at that very same moment I was running my own thriving shipping firm. I had built it from nothing, working 18-hour shifts, sweating on loading docks, fighting for contracts until my voice gave out. I was financially secure, stable, entirely self-sufficient. But I loved their mother with a depth they could not begin to fathom. I watched Nadine's eyes go wide as the truth began dismantling the false story she had believed her entire life. I told them I made a decision 40 years ago. I dissolved my entire company. I sold the trucks, the warehouses, and every asset I had ever accumulated to generate a massive surge of pure capital. I took every dollar of my hard-earned fortune and poured it straight into Loretta's failing business to pull her back from the edge of ruin. My money was the absolute foundation upon which their entire gleaming empire was constructed. I supplied the capital that steadied the ledgers and financed the global expansion. But I knew Loretta possessed a brilliant instinct for public relations and corporate strategy. She flourished in the spotlight while I was content in the quiet of the background. So I legally structured the parent trust to protect my original substantial investment, then stepped away from operations entirely. I let her carry the title of Chief Executive Officer. I let her grace the covers of business magazines and accept the awards because her happiness was the only return on investment I ever wanted. Preston stood staring at me, mouth working open and shut, without a sound escaping. The story he had used to justify every act of arrogant cruelty, that he was the rightful heir to a self-made corporate queen, and that I was merely a fortunate bystander, had just been demolished completely. I moved even closer to the table, my voice falling to a low, devastating whisper. I told him his mother never saw me as a shadow. She saw me as her absolute equal, her rescuer, and her true partner. And as her health began to fail, she watched clearly what her children were becoming. She saw the greed warping their hearts, the reckless and lavish, spending the contempt with which they looked down on working people. She understood that the instant she was gone, they would move to bleed the operational shell, dry in service of their own vanity. I told the silent room that Loretta did not leave me an empty envelope out of disrespect. She left me that envelope as a final, brutal test for her children. Had they shown me even a single ounce of compassion, had they let me grieve in the home I had built and simply treated me as their father, I would have opened the trust willingly and shared the true wealth with them. We could have managed the whole transition together as a family, but they could not hold off even 48 hours before handing me an eviction notice. They could not wait to freeze my modest personal accounts, to reduce me to begging for a humiliating allowance. I looked at Nadine, who was now openly weeping, both hands pressed over her face in absolute shame. I looked at Preston, shaking visibly as his entire constructed identity was peeled away before his hand-picked board members and the cameras of the press. I told them they had failed their mother's final test, in the most spectacular and pitiless way possible. They snatched at the shiny objects she had dangled as bait and discarded the man who actually owned the kingdom. I reminded them that they had publicly humiliated me in the lobby of my own building just 24 hours ago, telling me to go dig ditches if I wanted to eat. I turned slowly to face the terrified board members, frozen solid in their chairs. I advised them in plain terms that signing the golden parachute contracts currently sitting on that table would make them legally complicit in a major ongoing corporate fraud. I informed them that the forensic auditors working down the hall had already secured the digital records of Preston and Nadine's attempts to illegally sell corporate assets and destroy financial documents to bury their personal debts. The board members did not hesitate for even a moment. One by one, they seized the unsigned golden parachute contracts and shoved them back toward the center of the table, recoiling from Preston and Nadine, as though they had suddenly become infectious. The wealthy socialites and sycophants Preston had counted on to rubber stamp his theft were now deserting him in real time, frantically working to put distance between themselves and the catastrophic legal fallout. Vanessa and Kurt, recognizing that the empire was effectively dead, and that they were personally entangled in the missing funds, began quietly edging away from the table. The loyalty they had performed was entirely contingent on unlimited cash. Now that the money had evaporated, the instinct for self-preservation overrode everything, including their marriage. I stood at the head of the boardroom table, flanked by the sharp-minded attorney and the relentless auditors. I looked at my children, stripped of their power, their wealth, and their manufactured pride. The empire they believed they had conquered was nothing but a fragile house of cards, and I had just calmly, deliberately pulled out the foundation. I did not raise my voice or betray a trace of anger. I simply embodied the cold, hard, immovable weight of the consequences they had brought on themselves. The silence that settled after my declaration pressed down on the boardroom like a suffocating fog. The board members had physically retreated from the table, desperate to escape the blast radius of this corporate detonation. But Nadine refused to let the reality crashing around her take hold. Her face contorted into a mask of pure, frantic rage. She spun on her husband, voice cracking, ordering him to get their senior litigation team on the phone that instant. She screamed that they would file an emergency injunction, drag me into court, and prove to the world that I was a delusional old man forging documents to steal their rightful inheritance. She paced behind the leather chairs, arms flailing, demanding that Kurt fix everything right then and there. But Kurt did not reach for his phone. He did not match his wife's furious energy. He was standing motionless near the back of the room, eyes fixed blankly on the polished floor. A terrible thought had just cut through his rising panic. He reached slowly into his expensive leather briefcase and withdrew the thick bundle of documents they had signed in that windowless basement the day before, the contracts from the Shadow Investment Syndicate, the ones they had rushed to execute for a 30 cents on the dollar cash buyout to cover their mountainous personal debts. He flipped past the signature pages, eyes darting across the dense legal addendums they had completely glossed over in their scramble for salvation. As Kurt read through the fine print, the last remaining color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a corpse. His hands began to shake so badly that the thick pages rattled audibly in the quiet room. He stepped away from Nadine, as though she had become dangerous. He was not staring at a standard real estate transfer. He was staring at the lethal poison pill Mr. Caldwell had buried deep within the language of the contract. Nadine stopped pacing. She looked at her husband, her voice dropping to a frantic whisper, asking him what was wrong. Kurt could barely get the words out. He looked up, eyes wide with sheer absolute terror, and stammered that they were going to federal prison. Preston spun around, demanding to know what Kurt was talking about, insisting the shadow sale had nothing to do with this current disaster. Kurt slammed the documents down onto the nearest surface, his voice finally breaking into a hysterical shout. He read the clauses aloud, his voice bouncing off the mahogany walls. He revealed that the contract explicitly stated the sellers had acknowledged the superior legal claim of the parent trust over the operational shell. He read the passage where they had legally admitted to bypassing standard board approval to liquidate corporate assets for the sole purpose of covering personal private liabilities. He looked Preston dead in the eye and shouted that they had not merely signed a sales agreement, they had signed a legally binding confession to gross financial mismanagement, corporate embezzlement, and deliberate fraud, all under penalty of perjury. And then he read the final devastating clause. By putting their signatures on that document, they had explicitly waived any and all rights to severance packages, retention funds, or golden parachutes. Every last molecule of air left the room. Preston staggered backward and physically collapsed into one of the heavy leather chairs. The realization struck him with the force of a freight train. The shadow investor had not been a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. It was a trap constructed by my legal team, and he had walked straight into it, eagerly signing away his freedom for a fistful of cash that was never going to materialize. He had handed me irrefutable, airtight proof of his own criminal conduct. The fragile coalition of greed holding the four of them together shattered in an instant. Vanessa, who had been standing frozen near the glass walls while the disaster unfolded, suddenly jolted into motion. Self-preservation overrode every last remnant of familial loyalty. She had married Preston for his seemingly boundless wealth and corporate standing, not to spend the prime years of her life visiting him behind prison walls. She took a wide step away from her husband and leveled a trembling, accusing finger directly at him. She screamed that she had absolutely no knowledge of any embezzlement. She declared loudly for the benefit of the board members and the journalists pressing against the glass that Preston had lied to her about the company's true financial condition, that he had concealed the debts, and that she was entirely innocent of any corporate fraud. Kurt immediately followed her lead, turning on his own wife and on Preston, without a moment's hesitation to protect himself. He faced Nadine, and Preston, his voice saturated with venom and desperate self-interest. He shouted that he had done nothing beyond carry out the directives of the chief executive officer. He lied without missing a beat, claiming that Preston had ordered him to locate the shadow buyer, and that he had been coerced into taking part in the illegal liquidation under threat of losing his standing in the family. He declared himself a victim of their poisonous corporate manipulation. Nadine let out a gut-wrenching wail of absolute betrayal. She lunged at Kurt, driving her fists into his chest, screaming that he was a coward and a liar. She sobbed that the massive real estate debts were his doing, that he had pushed them into this desperate corner from the very beginning. Kurt shoved her away, his face twisted with contempt, telling her she was completely delusional and that he was walking out before she pulled him into a prison cell alongside her. Preston sat slumped in the heavy leather chair, watching his marriage dissolve and his sister turn on her own husband. The magnificent empire he had imagined himself ruling had been reduced to a vicious, squalid brawl among thieves. He had no lawyers to summon. He had no golden parachutes left to grab. He had no loyal allies remaining to stand beside him. He looked up at me, eyes red and swimming with tears of total, absolute defeat. I stood at the head of the table, perfectly still, watching the implosion complete itself. I had no need to raise my voice or add a single word of condemnation. Their own blinding greed had engineered the trap, and their own ruthless selfishness was now snapping it shut around them. They had turned on each other the very instant the money vanished, demonstrating precisely what their loyalty had always been worth. The financial checkmate was flawless, leaving them with nothing but the full, crushing weight of their own choices. The boardroom emptied with the panicked speed of a vessel going under. The wealthy board members Preston had assembled fled through the glass doors, refusing to meet the eye of the man who had gathered them there. Vanessa and Kurt were already in the hallway, arguing loudly over which one of them would call a divorce attorney first. Inside the grand boardroom, only my two children remained trapped in the wreckage of their own spectacular hubris. Preston was hunched in the heavy leather chair, with his face buried in his hands, while Nadine stared at the blank wall, her pristine designer dress, looking entirely out of place in a room she no longer commanded. I did not feel the sharp rush of vindictive satisfaction that a lesser man might have expected. What I felt was the deep, heavy silence of a father who had been forced to surgically remove a cancer from his own family. I turned to Mr. Caldwell, who stood motionless at my side, the quiet executioner of corporate law. I gave him a single subtle nod. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored suit and produced a single sheet of crisp white paper. He set it carefully on the polished mahogany table directly in front of Preston. Preston slowly raised his head, his bloodshot eyes settling on the document. He had no desire to read it, but the absolute silence in the room left him no choice. It was a formal legal eviction notice. It stated explicitly that Preston and Nadine Whitland, along with any of their personal associates, had exactly 24 hours to permanently vacate the corporate premises. They were to be escorted by security to collect their personal belongings and surrender all access keys, digital tokens, and corporate devices. Nadine let out a hollow, fractured laugh that sounded more like a dry sob. She whispered that 24 hours was impossible and told me I was throwing them into the street with absolutely nothing. I looked down at my daughter, the little girl I had taught to ride a bicycle, the young woman whose extravagant wedding I had quietly financed when her trust fund had temporarily run dry. A sharp pang of memory cut through me the afternoon I stood in my beloved greenhouse watering Loretta's orchids, while Nadine and her husband coldly handed me a 30-day eviction notice from my own home. They had told me to be gone by the weekend because my gardening boots were ruining their aesthetic. I told Nadine I had originally intended to give them the standard 30 days. I explained that 30 days was the legal minimum and the decent societal norm. I took a slow, deliberate step toward the table and leaned my weight on my hands just as Preston had done, when intimidating his own subordinates. I lowered my voice, letting the cold and unyielding truth press into their panicked minds. I told them I had changed my mind because I remembered the exact frigid tone they used when they ordered me out of the family estate less than 48 hours after their mother was laid in the ground. I reminded them that they had not given me 30 days. They had demanded I leave at once because my presence complicated their real estate timeline. Preston stared at the eviction notice, his hands trembling, as his fingers traced the raised seal of the parent trust at the foot of the page. He looked up at me, his voice cracking, asking where they were supposed to go. He pleaded that their credit lines were entirely frozen, that the banks had locked their personal accounts, and that Vanessa and Kurt had abandoned them completely. He begged me, saying they had no cash, no homes, and no friends left anywhere in the city. He asked how they were meant to survive the night. I straightened up and adjusted the cuffs of my bespoke suit. I told my son that when he drove me from the family estate, he never once thought to ask where I would sleep. I reminded him that when he froze my accounts and mocked me in the lobby of this very building, he specifically told me to go dig ditches if I wanted to eat. I told him that true survival is not something you inherit, it is something you earn. I told him that 40 years ago, when his mother and I were staring down total bankruptcy, we did not go begging our parents for an unearned rescue. We liquidated everything we owned. We lived in a cramped studio apartment and worked 18-hour shifts until our hands bled raw, building the very foundation of the empire they had just tried to steal. Mr. Caldwell stepped forward, signaling that the conversation was finished. He informed Preston and Nadine that corporate security was waiting outside the boardroom doors at that moment. He explained they would be permitted to take only their personal belongings. Any attempt to remove corporate documents, digital files, or company hardware would result in immediate federal theft charges on top of their already catastrophic legal exposure. He noted that the luxury company vehicles they had driven to the office that morning had already been repossessed by the fleet management team, acting under his direct orders. Preston rose on unsteady legs and reached for the sleek silver company laptop sitting on the table. Mr. Caldwell extended a firm, deliberate hand and placed it squarely over the device. He reminded my son without raising his voice that the machine belonged exclusively to the parent trust, and that walking out with it would earn him a police escort rather than a private security detail. Preston released the laptop as though it had burned his fingers, his shoulders caving entirely beneath the weight of his ruin. I turned my back on my children and walked toward the heavy mahogany doors. Nadine called out my name one final time, her voice fracturing under the weight of a desperate, agonizing plea from the daughter who had thrown her father away. I stopped at the threshold but did not turn around to face her. I spoke to the polished wooden doors, letting my last words carry through the grand, emptied room. I told them to leave their corporate keys on the reception console on their way out exactly as they had required of me at the estate. I stepped out into the bright, busy hallway and left the heavy doors wide open behind me. The security guards who had once been commanded to drag me out onto the street were now standing rigidly at attention, prepared to escort my fraudulent heirs out of the glass tower. The silence they left behind was not an empty void. It was the solid, unyielding foundation of a legacy finally purged of its most corrosive elements, fully secured and quietly reclaimed by the man who had built it. The days that followed their removal from the glass tower were a masterclass in financial gravity. Preston and Nadine had spent months scrawling their signatures across mountains of debt, convinced the corporate shell would absorb any personal fallout. They had entirely forgotten the ironclad personal guarantees they had hastily signed in boardrooms and yacht clubs. When the parent trust officially severed its ties to their hollow shell, the major banking institutions holding their debt moved without a moment's hesitation. The banks operated with a cold mechanical efficiency that made my legal maneuvers look almost gentle by comparison. These financial institutions had entire armies of attorneys whose sole purpose was to recover capital from failing debtors, and my children had just become their foremost targets. Every signature they had carelessly scrawled across loan applications was now a binding demand for immediate repayment. It began on a crisp Tuesday morning outside Preston's sprawling suburban estate. A fleet of heavy tow trucks rolled in unannounced, blocking his manicured driveway. Preston stood on his front porch in a wrinkled bathrobe, watching in stunned horror as the repo men hooked up his imported sports cars. He tried to confront the recovery agents, waving his arms, demanding they contact his wealth manager. The men simply pressed a thick stack of court orders into his hands and went on tightening the steel chains. His credit score had vanished overnight, and his lenders were moving aggressively to reclaim every physical asset and cover the massive unsecured loans he had taken against the corporate headquarters. Vanessa stood inside the grand foyer, observing the repossession through the tall bay windows. The illusion of boundless wealth had collapsed, and her survival instinct immediately overrode her marriage vows. She did not step outside to stand beside her husband in his worst moment. Instead, she walked calmly upstairs to the master suite and began filling matching luggage with her most valuable designer handbags and remaining jewelry. When Preston finally came back inside, utterly defeated, he found his wife by the front door with her bags packed and waiting. Vanessa offered no tears and no apologies. She simply placed a manila folder in his hands, expedited divorce papers, and told him flatly that she had no intention of spending her best years drowning in federal bankruptcy court. She walked out, climbed into a waiting taxi, and erased him from her life without a single backward glance. Preston stood alone in the vast bare hallway surrounded by empty walls, absorbing the realization that the love he believed he had purchased was entirely conditional on his bank balance. Across the city, Nadine was suffering her own catastrophic unraveling. She had gone to the marina hoping to find some solace aboard the 85-foot luxury motor yacht she had acquired just days earlier. When she reached the wooden docks, she found a heavy steel padlock on the gate and a team of maritime repo agents standing on the teak deck. The staggering 7-figure down payment had bounced completely, and the leasing agency was seizing the vessel for immediate breach of contract. Nadine dropped to her knees on the wooden planks, sobbing without restraint as the beautiful ship was slowly towed away from the dock. She grabbed her phone and frantically called her husband, pleading with him to fix the disaster. Kurt did not pick up. He was seated in a cramped lawyer's office, working desperately to cut his legal ties to the Whitland family. He understood that the massive speculative real estate loans he had taken on were now entirely unsupported. If he remained legally bound to Nadine, the banks would strip away whatever personal assets he still held to settle her fraudulent corporate debts. When Nadine eventually tracked him down at the luxury penthouse they had rented, she found him standing in the bare living room holding his own set of divorce papers. Kurt regarded her with undisguised contempt. He told her she was a serious liability, and that he was filing for immediate dissolution of the marriage to shield himself from the federal fraud charges bearing down on her. He walked out, leaving her sitting alone on the floor of an apartment they were both about to be evicted from. Nadine wept bitterly, fully grasping that the man she had conspired with to take my home was now showing her the identical ruthless cruelty they had once shown me. The social exile was total and devastating. Preston and Nadine had constructed their entire social worlds on a foundation of unearned wealth and lavish entertainment. The moment the money disappeared, their circle dissolved with it. Preston worked through his list of wealthy country club associates, reaching out for emergency loans or somewhere to stay. Every call went straight to voicemail. Nadine attempted to contact the socialites she had once showered with expensive gifts, only to find her number blocked at every turn. They were completely excommunicated from the privileged world they had believed they controlled. Within a single week, my 2 children found themselves standing on the cold city pavement with nothing whatsoever to their names. Their spouses had legally walked away, taking whatever liquid cash remained in the joint accounts. Their properties were locked under heavy bank foreclosures, and their credit was permanently destroyed. They were reduced to packing their few remaining clothes into cheap plastic bags, entirely stripped of the arrogance that had always defined them. They had believed themselves untouchable titans of industry, yet the crushing mass of their own debt revealed them as nothing more than reckless children who had been playing a very dangerous game. They had traded their family for the relentless pursuit of greed, and now they stood shivering in the devastating wreckage of total, absolute ruin. The heavy iron gates of the family estate stood perfectly still against the cold gray canvas of an early morning. These were the same gates I had passed through just weeks before, hauling a single old canvas duffel bag, convinced I had lost everything. Now I stood on the inside, the undisputed guardian of the legacy Loretta and I had built together, watching my two children shiver on the other side. Preston and Nadine looked entirely unrecognizable. The bespoke Italian suits and designer dresses were gone, replaced by wrinkled, ill-fitting clothes that looked salvaged from discount bins. Their faces were drawn and hollowed out by the grinding stress of total financial ruin and public shame. They looked like frightened, lost children, and yet I knew the darkness that still lived behind their desperate eyes. They had been at the gate for 20 minutes, pressing the intercom over and over. I finally walked down the long, winding driveway, my footsteps quiet in the still morning air. I did not open the gate. I stood behind the cold iron bars looking at these strangers I had once raised with so much unconditional love. Preston stepped forward and wrapped both hands around the black metal, his knuckles going white. His voice broke as he begged me to let them in. He wept that they had absolutely nothing remaining, that Vanessa and Kurt had both abandoned them, and that the banks had taken their very last penny. He sobbed that they had been sleeping in a cheap roadside motel and were hungry and frightened. Nadine pushed forward to the front, her face streaked with dried tears. She pressed herself against the iron bars and pleaded with me. She reminded me I was their father, that they were my own flesh and blood. She begged for forgiveness, telling me they had made a terrible mistake, that they had been young and blinded by greed. Then she asked the question that sealed their fate. She asked whether they could simply have the $1,000 allowance they had offered me at the reading of the will. She promised they would take the money and vanish, that they would never trouble me again, if I could only give them enough to get through the week. I looked at my daughter and thought of the day she stood in my greenhouse and told me to pack my bags so she could flip my home for a quick profit. I looked at my son and thought of the day he laughed at me in the lobby of his glass tower and told me to go dig ditches if I wanted to eat. I no longer felt anger. What lived in me now was only a profound, absolute emptiness where my love for them had once been. I spoke quietly, making sure my voice reached them clearly through the iron bars. I told them that when they offered me that $1,000, it was not offered out of love or compassion. It was offered as a degrading bribe, a way to scrub me from their lives, so they could pillage the empire Loretta and I had bled to construct. I reminded them that true survival is not something handed down by birthright. It must be earned through honest labor, sacrifice, and relentless determination. I told them that handing them money now would only be sustaining the greedy, entitled parasites they had decided to become. I took one slow, deliberate step back from the gate. I told my children that 40 years ago, their mother and I began with absolutely nothing beyond our own two hands and an unshakable faith in each other. I told them the time had come to learn how to build a life from the ground up exactly as we once had. I turned my back on them, shutting out their desperate, agonized cries and the rattling of the heavy iron gates. I walked the length of the long driveway back toward the large, quiet house, leaving them to face the full and devastating weight of the consequences they had so ruthlessly brought upon themselves. The truth is that family is not simply defined by the blood you share. It is built through mutual respect, steadfast loyalty, and a love that asks for nothing in return. We so often close our eyes to the cruelty of those closest to us, out of a misplaced sense of obligation, letting them drain our kindness until nothing remains. I learned in the hardest way imaginable that drawing firm boundaries is not an act of cruelty. It is the deepest form of self-preservation. There are times when walking away from the people you love is the only way to protect yourself from the people they have chosen to be. If you have stayed with me all the way to the end of this story, then you already know it was never simply about money or buildings or legal documents. It was about what a family can become when greed is allowed to grow in the place where love once lived. Looking back, I can say honestly that this journey cost me things. I will never fully recover years of quiet grief, a home I had built with my own hands, and the image of the children I once believed in completely. But I also came to understand something I could not have learned any other way. I believe God does not waste our suffering. The Lord's timing is rarely comfortable, but it is never careless. What felt like the end of everything turned out to be the moment the truth finally had enough room to breathe. If these father stories have taught you anything, I hope it is this. First, never sign away what is yours under pressure. Desperation is the oldest tool manipulators use, and the fine print always tells the real story. Second, the way someone treats you when they believe you have nothing left reveals exactly who they are. Watch that closely. Third, if you sense that something is being hidden from you, do not confront too soon. Gather your proof. Let the truth build its own case. Fourth, a dad's revenge does not have to be loud or bitter. Sometimes the most powerful thing a father can do is simply outlast the storm and let justice do the work. If this story moved you, please share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you have not yet subscribed to his Hidden Revenge, I would be honored to have you stay. Leave a comment telling me what stayed with you. Your words genuinely matter to me. Thank you for being here. Until next time, take good care of yourself.